some logistics. Okay, so I believe the recording is started. And so, yeah, yep, let everyone know that they're being recorded, and that's a privacy policy. So just to let everyone know. All right, and now I'm going to share my screen. And we will get started. Oops, this is the wrong one. Okay. So thanks everyone again for joining. The topic of this GMP hot seat today is bias and risk management. And I'm, like I mentioned, really happy to introduce Dr. George Ball that's joining us today from University of Indiana. I'm just going to provide a quick bio intro to Dr. Ball. So those of you who may not be already familiar with Dr. Ball's work can sort of understand where he's coming from in his background. So George Ball is the Weimer Faculty Fellow and Associate Professor of Operations and Decision Technologies at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University, Bloomington. So George's research focuses on product recalls across multiple industries, with a particular focus on FDA-regulated medical devices and pharmaceutical recalls. So George has conducted collaborative research projects with so CDRH as well as CEDAR, so different centers within FDA. George was a member of the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Ad Hoc Committee on the Security of America's Medical Product Supply Chain. George's research has been published in several top-tier journals, including Management Science, Manufacturing and Service Operations Management, Production and Operations Management, and the Journal of Operations Management. And prior to his time at Indiana University, George spent 11 years in various manager and director roles at 2 medical device companies and 5 years on active duty as U.S. naval officer. George received his PhD in supply chain and operations and MBA from the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota and a BS in aerospace engineering from the U.S. Naval Academy. Quite an impressive resume, George. Thanks for sharing that with us, and thanks for joining us. Now, one little fact that I have to mention is that George and I actually we met in the last year, but unbeknownst to either of us, we were at one point co-workers at Guidant back in the mid-2000s, right? Where that company was working on drugs and devices. So they were working, we were working on probably different projects, but in the world of drugs and medical devices. So it's really fun also to work with a former coworker. So with that said, George, thanks again for joining. How are you doing this, what is it, Tuesday morning out in Indiana?
Everything is great. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I'm really happy to be here.
All right. So we'll go ahead and get started. But what I'd like to understand before we get into we're going to examine 3 of your papers that were published in recent years, really focusing around the idea of bias in risk management, right? Because, I mean, ideally, when we think about protecting and promoting public health through the manufacture of devices, drugs, whatever, right? We expect that leaders actually making this decisions, like, for example, about recalls, which, we could say have direct impact to patient safety. We would hope, or maybe that's optimistically, that the decisions being made by those leaders are really impartial, right? With the decision really being made based on available science and really what's best for patient safety. Obviously, you're weighing different things, because recalling a product unnecessarily causes panic, right, within public health, and really could add significant risks in that way, right? But on the other hand, not recalling a drug or medical device that could be actively causing harm is risky, but just on the opposite side of the spectrum. It's a really interesting, let's say, almost a conundrum between weighing these 2 factors. And we would hope that leaders are making these decisions free from bias. So what we're going to do today is look at what does the data tell us, right? Well, obviously, we all have our own opinions, right? But what does the data tell us? And what lessons can we learn? We're going to sort of finish up the session with what lessons can we learn about what the data shows us about leaders, right? And how we can interpret that to decisions that we all make on a daily basis, in whatever jobs we happen to hold within our industry. All right. But first of all, George, how did you even get, I looked at your resume. Obviously, you came from the U.S. Naval Academy and spent some time in the Navy. How did you transition from that start to where you are now, really focusing on this really important topic of risk management?
Yeah, so when I was getting out of the Navy, I worked with a recruiter called Cameron Brooks that is very good at placing junior officers with some management experience into companies. And it's
Okay.
kind of an alternative to getting an MBA. And at the time I was married and we actually had a child, and so I didn't have the freedom to go to graduate school. So I worked with Cameron Brooks, and they introduced me to a whole. You basically, when you work with them, you agree that you'll solely try to get a job through them. And so
Okay.
you go to a conference with them right before you get out of the military, and you're introduced to all these different companies. One of them was Guidant, who I had never heard of before, headquartered in Minnesota, where I had never been before. I grew up in Michigan, but in the Navy, I had been all over the world. But at the time, I was living in Virginia, in Norfolk, with my wife, and so the Guidant interview went great. I remember it very well because Guidant was such a employee-centered, excellent place to work. They were winning
Hmm.
top places to work year after year, and I
Right.
am sure you can attest there was a great reason for that. It was an incredibly collaborative, positive culture. I
It was.
really
I
enjoyed working
loved
there.
every minute of it.
Yeah, it was just the leaders really knew what they were doing in building a company where every employee cared about how the company performed.
Hmm.
As an example of that, my production line operators all had stock in the firm. As soon as you
Mm.
were a full-time employee, you were given firm stock. So everybody knew what the share price was at any point in time, and everybody cared,
Hmm. Yeah.
which definitely ties into what we're going to talk about here today.
Yeah.
So I was placed on a production line, a second shift pacemaker production line. I had never been in a production line, and I didn't know anything about manufacturing. I had an engineering degree, but I think the reason I got the job was because I had some management experience and I had an engineering degree. And so thankfully I took to the role, and I had a fantastic manager. Her name was Beth Bartell. She taught me everything I knew about lean manufacturing, and um, I was really able to run with that. And in the process, I got an MBA at the Carlson School, um, got a few promotions, and was enjoying my time at Guidant. And then Guidant had some serious problems, which we're going to talk about in one of these papers. And it got a lot less fun at Guidant, very fast.
Mm.
I was there in 2004, 2005. It became sort of a nightmare. And
Hmm.
most of my colleagues left
Hmm.
and went to other companies. And I found this startup opportunity. I went to a small startup, AGA Medical, had another 5 years there that were just incredible.
Hmm.
Really great experience. So I got to the end of my time at AGA, and I'll actually tell this little anecdote. The CEO of the company wanted to send me to a executive development program at the Kellogg School at Northwestern. And at the
Hmm.
time, I had an executive MBA from the Carlson School. So I basically said, look, I don't want to go. Um, and it was a 3-week live-in program in Chicago. And
Hmm.
I had 3 young kids. I said, I don't want to go. I'd rather not. And it was a $30,000 program. And he's like, no, no,
Whoa.
no, yeah, it was very expensive. And, the company was paying. And so I
Yeah.
said, I'd rather not go. I don't need this. I have an MBA. He's like, no, you're on the fast track for one of our executives someday. Everybody who's where you are needs to go. So I went, I was forced to go. And this is why I became a professor, believe it or not, because this was in November of 2009. And I'm
Uh-huh.
sitting at the Kellogg School, bored out of my mind because I had had an MBA. And I'm like, I know this material. Nobody in the
Yeah.
class had an MBA but me. And so I started like really closely observing the faculty.
Hmm.
And I was like, wow, those look like really cool jobs. And at the time I was a little bit bored at my
Yeah.
job, and I was about to do something. I was going to look for something new anyway.
Yeah.
So I emailed a professor at the Carlson School who taught my MBA, who I had stayed in touch with. And I'm like, I think I'd like to be a professor. What would
Yeah.
that take? And he's like, well, you have to get a PhD. And we're exchanging emails while I'm at Kellogg. And I'm like, can I do that at night and keep my job? And
Yeah.
he's like, no, 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 that's not how it works. You quit your job. It's 5 years full time. You make $25,000 a year. And it's a huge commitment. And by the way, you're on the older side. You need to, most PhD students for business schools are in their mid to late 20s. And at
Yeah.
the time I was in my mid to late 30s. So I did it anyway. My wife is pretty adventurous. We quit my job, found a way to survive for 5 years on 25,000 a year. I learned that there's this thing called the earned income credit in the tax return, which I had never even heard of, and all of a sudden I was benefiting from it. Anyway, and then I got a job here at Kelly. So when I
Hmm.
got to my PhD, to answer your question directly, I know that was a roundabout way. My advisor had worked in the automotive industry, but she hadn't done anything on recalls. And
Hmm.
my biggest headache from industry was recalls. It was something that I
Mm.
lived with every day as a manufacturing manager, director. I don't know how many meetings I've been in on recalls, but they were terrible decisions to
Mm.
make.
Mm.
And so I asked her about what's been done on recalls in academia. She pointed me to a few studies, and I did a lit review, and I realized that there was very little done. And it was this kind of unique phenomenon in academia that hadn't been really examined. I think academics treated it as a subset of product quality, but they didn't
Hmm.
exactly know what to do about it. And and so I built my entire dissertation around the topic of recalls. I got tenure based off of it. I mean, every paper pretty much I have is a recall paper. In academia, I'm definitely, at least in operations, I'm kind of known as a recall person, and that can be a good or bad thing. You know, it's definitely nailed me into this very precise area of expertise. Um, I'm trying to branch out a little bit, but I really enjoy it. And what I enjoy most is the decision-making process, which is relates into what we're talking about today. The
Yeah.
bias that people knowingly or unknowingly fall prey to in these decisions, I find fascinating because I was in these meetings, and as I do the research now and I tie it back to some of my experiences in these decision-making meetings, I can see the I can see the tie-in. I can see the research kind of making sense based on looking back in time.
Right. Like I think we all probably have that, our own opinions about how these different factors influence. It's just when I was reading your papers, it's like, okay, it sort of solidifies all these, concepts that you generally think about in the world of public health. Just because the data, might say like the data is the data, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it is what it is, and I think we're going to see it's a little bit unfortunate.
Yeah.
So,
But I mean, human beings fall prey to biases, a lot of them unconsciously in every
mm,
decision we make. So it
hmm,
actually would be surprising not to find the influence of biases in this decision because it's such a high stakes decision.
yeah,
Nobody's done the research until now on it, which is why I'm able to publish these papers. But executives have these biases in R&D decisions, in everything, in personnel decisions. They also just whether we'd like to think that these recall decisions are objective, they're absolutely not. And I think, as you know, the FDA knows that. Like, there's all sorts of discretion in these decisions. And the FDA, I think, is aware that there's discretion, but not necessarily how it manifests itself.
mm,
Um, and which is why these papers are of interest to the FDA as well, I think.
yeah. I have too many questions about that, but I want to hold those off because I want to go through the paper first because I'm really like the first thing that comes to mind is okay, well, how can we solve this? But first, I want to go through the actual what does the data say? I don't want to jump to that discussion before we go through this. So the first of the three papers that we're going to examine today is on specifically in the medical device world. So CEO stock ownership and market actions. This was recently published in just a couple of months ago, if I'm correct on that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And just to give folks on the line sort of an overview of the challenges is, first of all, and I remember this from working within the FDA, is that FDA does not possess the legal authority to, generally speaking, recall products within the United States. So that's a voluntary action that has to be taken by companies. Of course, FDA can pressure a company to recall products, in different ways. But ultimately, the legal authority does not lie with the FDA, it lies only with the company. The second point is now I'd like you to sort of get if you would go into some of the contributing factors, like the underlying biases that you found in this paper, and which I guess you mentioned it's not surprising, I guess, but at the same time it is, because again, we have maybe this idealistic view of the world that people, especially when other people's safety and is on the line, they will always make the right decision. Now, and that's generally true, but these unconscious factors, I think, are what I'm kind of really interested in this paper, right? And so, if you could just talk for a moment about those factors or what did you find when you executed this research?
Sure. So these causes that you list here, which are in the paper as well, they're the explanations that were crafted both in advance and afterwards, testing this main relationship, which is the amount of stock that a CEO owns as a predictor of how quickly the firm decides to recall a medical device. Now, when we say how quickly, it's important to know that we have this very unique data from the FDA, which is the date that the firm first became aware of the defect and the date that the firm recalled the product voluntarily.
Mm-hmm.
And we use those two dates to create a time to recall. So in one of my presentations to the FDA, in the inspector bias paper, a director of analytics at the FDA said, you should do some studying of this defect awareness date. And I didn't know, this was in the middle of my dissertation, and I said, I don't know what that date is. And she said, well, the FDA has this date that the firms have to tell us when they decide to recall, but it's not generally known by the public. It's not, if you go onto the public recall interfaces online, you never see this defect awareness date. But if you FOIA it, if you issue a Freedom of Information Act, you're given it. I was actually just given it to me by this head of analytics at the FDA during my dissertation, and subsequently I have now FOIA'd it several times, and their FDA gives it. And so we create this time to recall. On average, it's about 90 days, roughly. So what that means is that's the amount of time from when the firm first acknowledges they knew about the first defect related to this recall to when they decided to recall. And our question is, what may predict that speed being faster or slower related to executive stock ownership? The question itself came from the lead authors, Darby and Ketchen, who are good friends of mine, and they're management scholars. And this CEO stock ownership is more along the lines of their areas of expertise. And I'm the one with the recall timing data. So we kind of got together and added the fourth author, who's an empirical master. He's one of the strongest empiricists in our field, so that all of the statistics in this are incredibly rigorous. And so we asked that question well before we wrote the paper. Our bias, our belief was the more stock a CEO owns, the longer they're going to take. We all kind of knew that instinctively because we had experience with this recall data. And we found that it's a very strong effect. And one of the most exciting things in research for me is when you go into a study with these expectations, before you've even touched the data, and you can't answer the question rigorously for many months. To collect and clean this data before you can even run it through a statistical model takes months. So months after we got together, and we decided we wanted to test this. We finally got to run the regression models, and it's a very strong effect. So the more stock, the longer the time to recall. And so then we had to explain what we intuitively felt was going to be the case. And explaining that in a very comprehensive and clear way is how you get the paper published. And so I give the editors of the paper some credit for the three. They pushed us hard on why this would be the case.
Mm.
So we have like 3 reasons on page 4 of the paper, building up to hypothesis 1, and they sort of pushed us into these areas. They didn't exactly come up with these, but they said, look, you haven't argued well enough why this would be the case.
Okay, so the data showed a strong correlation, as you mentioned, but
Yeah.
the editor of the publication or the reviewers, I should say, wanted you to explain, like, okay, so your
Why?
hypothesis should, but like, why, right? Okay,
Yeah. The
yeah,
why. And one thing that was very challenging to convince these reviewers and editors is that the CEO had this much influence over the recall decision.
okay,
They really didn't buy that. And some people on this call may not buy it. And I actually, that's a fair challenge. In my first company at Guidant, right? Ron Dollins was the CEO, if you remember Ron, right? Like there's no there's not a direct relationship between Ron Dollins and the decisions we were making in St. Paul on a pacemaker recall, right? I mean, that's a very long stretch. In my
hmm
second company, there was 100 people, and I saw the
hmm
CEO on a daily basis. And the CEO
mm,
talked about his stock on a daily basis. And so I think the size of the company can have an effect for sure.
mm,
But the way we believe that this effect at a Guidant type of or a Medtronic type of company, the way we believe the effect is felt is through the culture that is set, right? Like the CEO may not make the decision on a daily basis, but she or he sets the tone for how the decision is made. You either are a you either quickly act to pull these products back when you know there's a problem, or you focus heavily on these, like the first bullet, these off ramps. Oftentimes we may think, this is customer user error. Let's just give it some time. This probably will go away. You see this error that you've never seen. A physician is trying to put in a device and something happens and you have trouble explaining it. And you're like, well, we can't explain it. Let's wait to see if we get some more. And that's what this off ramp is. And that's really a consequence of the culture. The culture is either, when we sniff something out, let's move quickly, or let's be very deliberate and use data, and let's only act when we know there's a real problem. Those are 2 cultures that one could argue are both good. Um, but what we argue in the paper is that when you tie the financial performance of the firm, in particular the stock price, to that executive, the culture is more likely to be one where you're going to look for those off ramps. You're going to find every reason not to recall, because as soon as you do, those whose financial livelihood is tied to the financial success of the firm, especially in the stock price, they're going to suffer consequences, personal consequences.
this is just, it has so many implications. I mean, what we're talking about here is obviously the decision to recall a product or not, right? Would you say though that, I mean, so say I could give you another data set from industry, which is at a much lower level, like for example, like closing a deviation in a certain number of days, right? Considering the root cause evaluation and all product impact and all those, factors that you have to include in those deviations. Because you've shown that like a culture can affect, really this is subconscious, right? Would you say like the exploring off ramps, fear, personal wealth, these are like subconscious factors that manifest themselves in a culture. Would you say that those same factors are going to influence other less important decisions, even maybe to a more of a significant degree, like
I mean, that's a
closing a
very good point,
deviation?
right? Because recalls have external involvement, regulator
Yeah, right.
involvement, there's
Right.
legal involvement. When there's much less external scrutiny of the decision, I assume that that would be, and I think the literature that we cite in this paper around stock market and compensation driven biases of executives, I think all that would show it, that it's a good thing on the one hand to incent executives to tie their incentives to the firm's success.
Sure.
That's the reason that it's done in the first place. However, there's hidden unintended consequences to that, and that's kind of the purpose of the paper, is to show we're not advocating that executives shouldn't have their compensation tied to the firm's success. Like, you definitely would want that. You just have to be aware that there's consequences to that, and that's really where the governance aspect comes in. The board of directors owns that responsibility because they set the compensation for the CEO, and so they need to be aware. In extreme cases, there are some executives of like tech firms where all their compensation is stock, or most
Yeah.
of it is. Like
Yeah.
there's some risks there that that this study helps boards to be made aware of, and the FDA. Like, if I believe this research, as I do, and I worked at the FDA, which I don't, I would use this. Like, this is public data. It's not hard to
Hmm.
find out how much stock a CEO has. There's so
Yeah.
many studies that are coming out on how these decisions are biased in different ways, whether it's gender or compensation. I think the FDA could use them. I'm not sure they do. I think they probably are more myopic in what they focus on. They focus on their data,
Hmm.
and they, from my experience, they believe these papers to an extent, but not to the extent that they're going to change much based on it. I don't think.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's my experience, though. We could have
Yeah.
people from the FDA. Do you often have FDA people on your calls?
Yes. So there probably are some.
Okay, good to
um,
know.
yeah. The uh, you know, I think the real implications that really are really hit home for, I think, a lot of us on the line that come from maybe the pharma manufacturing side is the culture. We've been quality culture has been a hot topic since for I'd say almost going on 15 years, right?
Yeah.
And and now I think we see like the reason why there has been such an emphasis in this area, because it's so significant, the quality culture. And so I
Yeah.
love here that we have an actual measurement of quality culture. And then,
Yeah.
so you're going to see, like, in the data as I go through, like we talked about unconscious and conscious factors. I did, we, thank you for not getting into this statistical evaluation, because that is incredibly robust and it was difficult for me to understand
Yeah.
as a
Awesome.
non-statistician. But I can tell that when you say it's robust, you're exactly right.
Yes,
Um,
this is like the consequence of a top journal. So depending on
yeah,
what journal you go to, like
yeah,
this is an Informs journal, and
uh-huh,
Informs is the best business publication set of journals. An Informs journal is going to push you to your limits. They're going to push that data hard. And so when you look through it, you think, why did they test so many different ways the same question? Well,
yeah,
that's an outcome of the review process.
okay,
That it doesn't get submitted in the first round like that. It transforms through the review process, which is a 2-year process usually,
okay,
where a reviewer or editor is going to say, "What about this? What about this?" They're looking for alternative explanations. They're looking for mechanisms. They're looking for all the ways that the relationship could potentially break down.
yeah, incredible. It sounds like a painful process.
It's the
And
worst. It's horrible. Yeah, it's horrible.
I think now to sort of summarize a little bit more on the paper's conclusion. So ideally, like, the speed with which a faulty medical device is recalled should be driven predominantly by the potential harm to consumers, right? We talked about that. However, the analysis reveal that the CEO stock ownership may be, at least in part, a reason why defective medical devices stay on the market longer than perhaps desired, to the detriments of patients, the company, stockholders, and, ironically, in the end, the CEO. I really liked that. Um, and I think, that's again to be expected, right? We always say, to company, like for example, doing an FDA inspection, you would say like, yeah, you can take shortcuts, now, but you're ultimately going to pay for those shortcuts in the end. Like that, sort of seems to ring true in a lot of areas. And is that what you found here, right? Was that, you did
Right.
delay and ultimately you paid for it.
Right. So the title that we submitted this paper on was Bad Things Come to Those Who Wait. And it was all about the fact that not only does more stock ownership lead to longer time to recall, but longer time to recall negatively influences the stock price. And those two findings were both novel. They hadn't been shown in our literature either. And so the CEO is hurting themselves in a sense by waiting too long to make the decision. And the editors didn't like the bad things come to those who wait. They were kind of sensitive to the judgmental nature of it. So,
Yeah, I could see that.
yeah.
So you mentioned the three factors, and then and here's the conclusion. So a 1 standard deviation increase, so that would be a 2% increase in the percentage of shares owned by the CEO, is associated with a defective medical device remaining on the market for an additional 26 days. That seems to be quite significant. Uh, Most concerning is that the recall slowing effects of CEO stock ownership are strongest for high severity recalls, which reveals that the recall delays associated with CEO stock ownership, whether intentional or unintentional, may increase public health risks. So when you have a high severity recall, the time to recall you found was longer.
It's even longer. Like if you take away CEO stock from any kind of prediction model and you just do a descriptive analysis on how long do firms take to recall devices and you break it out by class, the class threes are the fastest, which in somewhat makes sense because those are the low severity, low impact. And I remember making class three recall decisions or being part of the meetings. There's not a lot of concern. There's not a lot of stress. Just do it, is what you're often told. The class ones are incredibly important, and the class twos are kind of in between. And so the more severe, the longer it takes, and the relationship between stock ownership and time is longest and it's strongest for the high severity recalls.
But George, this doesn't make sense to me. I mean, shouldn't the highest severity recalls be the quickest? You said it
It
makes sense, but
it
how does
makes
that
sense
make
to
sense?
me because those are the ones that you're most afraid of initiating. So a class one recall this can be a very big deal, right? And so an executive team is not going to back a class one recall unless they know that it's legitimately the company's problem. Like, did we actually cause this? And that takes time. It takes engineering time. It takes root cause analysis. It's not something that happens immediately. And
But why do
you
you have
can,
to do that before you can do that later? The
but you,
ability to do root cause evaluation doesn't depend on whether the recall has started or not.
that's a different paper that experimental paper I told you about. That's what we do is we examine if root cause understanding is a main factor in the decision. And it really is a strong one.
But it
So
shouldn't be.
I'm not so sure. So here's an example.
Okay.
Um, we at Guidant, I think when you were probably there, we had the PDM triple stack recall. Does that ring a bell in your mind at all?
Well, I was in the stent area though, so
Okay.
that
So
I
we had
knew
a
of those recalls, but not in the detail.
yeah, we had a pacemaker recall where the battery was depleted early
Yeah.
because of a short.
Yep.
And the short had to do with how the integrated circuits were stacked on top of each other. The failures were very random and very few. And there was just one market, the Japanese regulatory agency, that basically said you can no longer sell in Japan until you find the root cause of this. And we hadn't done a recall yet. And so it was like two failures that Japan was basically saying you must find the reason these things shorted. And
Hmm.
we dug, and I wasn't a part of the engineering analysis, others were, but the company dug and dug and dug, and they finally realized why the short was happening. It took a long time. And as soon as they
Hmm.
realized why it was happening, they recalled everything in the United States, right? So
Mm.
it was dependent upon understanding why these few products were failing. And as soon as they understood, and they understood that it was a design flaw and that it was likely to keep happening, not only did they find a fix, but they recalled absolutely everything, not just the products in Japan.
Okay.
And that, so I mean, root cause analysis is important because if it's not the fault of the company, if it's like the physician is doing something wrong, we need to train them better. You're not going to waste
Okay.
time recalling products.
All right.
Um, it's like
So like,
it's similar to the Toyota um, floor mat unintended acceleration problem that Toyota had.
mhm.
They were hesitant to recall their cars because they didn't think it was their fault. Even though there were some car accidents happening, they're like, this is a floor mat issue. This isn't probably wrong with our. And in the end, they did the recall. And then
Mhm.
subsequently, I think with a study with NASA, they determined it wasn't actually their fault. But root cause is a
Wow.
big part of it, actually.
Okay. I guess when you put it in that context, it makes me a little bit more comfortable with it. Um, and actually, I'm interested. You in part of this paper, you looked at some other examples of faults, right? Of recalls, and I believe Boeing is one of them. Is that right?
Right. We brought up Boeing as an example of, so one of the editors or reviewers pushed us and said, look, one of the reasons here could be that when the CEO owns a lot of stock, they are not the kind of CEO that is they're high power and not approachable. And that is a consequence of having a lot of stock. And so that lack of approachability could lead to slower recall decisions. That was like a reviewer idea. And so we
Mm-hmm.
built on that and said, well, actually, we don't really know about that in the medical device industry, but there's congressional interviews with some Boeing engineers when they had the 737 MAX problem. And these
Yep.
engineers were like, we were afraid to bring up the fact that this was going to cause a crash. And it had to do with like the lack of approachability of executives. So that's what we bring
Wow.
in, this kind of lack of approachability as a
Wow.
reason that could potentially explain why the more stock you have, more slowly these decisions could be made.
Ooh, that is scary. So you mentioned some solutions in the paper, and I'd be interested if we could go through some of those. So we've sort of now we've understood the problem of bias, subconscious mostly in this case. What are something that we could do to solve some of these problems? And I'd like if we could expand not just from recalls, but I would love to explore a little bit the quality culture as well, right? Because as we mentioned, this is we can see that it's affecting recall decision, right? The data is the data. But what
Right.
about all these other factors that are going on in day-to-day manufacturing, and you know them very well, right?
Yeah.
That require, risk-based decisions like, okay, close this deviation, or go ahead and open a work order there, or don't, or just that goes in the batch record, that doesn't. Like all these, what could be very critical decisions going on in a day-to-day basis. Now we know they're affected by culture, which you've shown. How can we fix this?
Right. I mean, I agree with you that the CEO measure is really a proxy for the quality culture at the
Mm-hmm.
firm. I think that's really a good way to think about it. It's just one way to measure that quality culture, and it does affect everything. And I mean, I've only was at two companies, one small, one big. The cultures changed not just across companies, but within companies across time as different people took over.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think one thing that's important is the independence and strength of the quality function at the company. In the manufacturing group, sometimes you'd look into the at the quality engineers as hysterical individuals that were always crying wolf in a sense. And I
Mm.
remember in particular, so when I was a production manager at Guidant, I was a pretty aggressive production manager. When I say that recall was kind of the last thing I wanted. And my
Yeah.
incentives, I really believe incentives are closely tied to this. If your
Yeah.
incentives are not aligned towards quick recall decisions, then you're not going to make quick recall decisions. You can't just trust a person's care for humanity when you've
Yeah.
tied their livelihood, their incentives to whether or not you have quality problems. I think I told you in one company, I had a bonusable objective for no recalls in this calendar year. It was my number one bonusable objective. And my
Yikes.
bonus was tied to it. And I remember telling my manager at the time, I'm like, do you realize the behavior? And this was before I was an academic. I was like, do you realize the behavior this is going to drive? Because as a manager of a production line, I know how to put things to bed and say, no, no, we're not going to deal with this, or we are going
Yeah.
to deal with this. So if you bonus me off of that, I'm going to, then you're just relying on your integrity, which I would like to think I'm a high integrity individual, but I'm also susceptible to these biases. And so
Hmm.
I think that culture is real. It's tied to the incentives that managers have. And the CEO stock is just one aspect of it. There's a gender aspect, which is in the second paper we might talk about. There's the power. So the quality of the power of the quality function at the firm is a very important role. Um, Meaning if the quality engineers and the quality manager are respected and their authority is strong, I think that that's a good thing. I quick anecdote I had when I was at Guidant, there was one of our quality engineers who will obviously remain nameless, who would walk into a recall decision-making meeting, and I observed this behavior once. It was a Friday afternoon. We had just discovered something on production line. And one of the engineers was like, we might need to think about a recall for this. And I'm the manager. I'm like, oh, great. So we get into
Hmm.
the room, and this quality engineer walks in, and the individual says, we need to recall. And this person
Hmm.
had not heard they did not know any of the details. They didn't know the root, they didn't know anything. They were like,
Yeah.
recall. It's a Friday at 4 o'clock, and this person and they didn't know any. And so for me, that's like your bias is just to recall. My
Yeah.
bias then is to not, and we're gonna kind of fight it out until we make the right decision for the company. Those are the problems that firms face, right? You have
Yeah.
incentives. Incentives are driving people to do the wrong things, I think, sometimes.
And I think
So,
many people, yeah, go ahead.
well, finding an incentive structure that rewards the right behavior for especially when it comes to these recall decisions, that's the key. And I don't know exactly what that looks like.
Yeah.
But I know that, when you give someone a bonusable goal to not have a recall, that's probably not it. Like there's got to be better ways of doing it.
Yeah. And I think, you know, we mentioned quality culture has been around for going on 15 years as sort of a hot topic in our industry. And it was, in the early days, there was big efforts through PDA, through different regulators and others to sort of figure out how can we measure quality culture, right? And so you had those 5 or 6 different metrics that industry came up with along with the regulators as well, and said, okay, here are the things like, for example, confirmed OOS rates or there were other things. Like this was supposed to measure your quality culture. Now that whole program got laid to rest. I want to say around 2021, right? Finally, they came. University of St. Gallen's was a big player, right? They did a bunch of research over the years, and basically in an ISPE meeting in 2021 said, really, after 10 years of research, we can't really figure this out. And but what I think you're showing in some of these papers is so fascinating to me is like this quality culture. You're sort of going you're going on the upstream, right? So I think we maybe had the wrong idea when we started. We tried to measure the downstream, right? What I think you're saying here is it might be better to measure the upstream effects, right? In order to determine how good or not maybe your quality culture could be. Is there a way? Let me just ask you this, George. Is there a way to measure quality culture downstream?
Yeah, I don't know. I
Deviation
think that's
rates, or I don't know.
I think that this time to recall, it's not even used very well at the FDA.
Hmm.
In my work with the FDA in the last few years, I bring it up. I brought it up a couple times with some directors. I'm like, well, have you thought about looking at time to recall, time to recall? They don't, I know it's not something of great interest to them. I think it's a fascinating measure. We see
Yeah.
huge variation on it. Like it's got a lot of variation. The times go from one day to 3 years. right? And so like there's so much great variation in this data. That's why all
Yeah.
these statistical models are really powerful, because you're predicting a highly variable outcome. I
Yeah.
would use time to recall, and I would go deep into it. And if I were an FDA inspector coming to a plant, I would ask them, I want you to walk me through your recall decision-making process.
Mm.
What do you do from beginning to end? It's so ad hoc at each company, in these two companies, and even within the companies. Like a pacemaker recall decision-making meeting versus defibrillator one versus a stent one, like you have different people involved. And because it's a relatively uncontrolled discussion, where
Hmm.
I mean, I've been in these meetings where it's like, well, should we do it or not? It's like in the end, you just have a bunch of managers sitting around trying to make the decision. If I was the
Yeah.
FDA, I'd be like, you need to put incredibly tight structure around these meetings so that these biases don't creep in. And
What
there's
could you
ways
do?
to kind of keep them from creeping in.
And I think that FDA really has some, well, FDA and all, well, I should say all regulators, because it's a harmonized document. When we talk about the revisions to ICH-Q9, right, which is risk management, they talk about utilization of the full spectrum of formality, right? So from very less formal tools to more formal tools. But unfortunately, companies have been maybe a little bit reluctant to actually open up that toolbox. But I wonder if through the introduction of all these risk management tools, with recalls, with how to close deviations, with all these other things included, we can take that subjectivity, like for example our unconscious biases, and try to get them under control.
Yeah. Like one example of bias, and I don't think this is a paper you brought up. There's this cognitive reflection test.
Mm-hmm.
It's a test of how much you reflect before making a decision. It's
Okay.
a relatively well-known test now, so it's not as useful today as it was 10 years ago, but it's developed by this professor at MIT, and it's not an intelligence test. It's a how much you reflect test. We did a behavioral experiment at a large medical device company looking for factors that predict the likelihood of deciding to recall a potentially defective medical device. And we presented these randomized treatments about the device that was possibly failing. And at the end, we gave everybody the CRT test. And the most predictive factor in this study was the CRT. And what it meant is
What's
that
CRT?
cognitive reflection test.
Oh yeah, okay, sorry, yep, okay.
So the higher you scored on the cognitive reflection test, the much less likely you were to recall. And the conclusion that we drew from that is this sense of like analysis paralysis, that if you're a
Oh
highly analytical and reflective individual,
yeah,
you're more like the person that's going to say, no, 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 we're not ready to recall yet. We need more
yeah,
data. We need more
okay.
analysis. Let's look at it harder. Whereas the people that were knee-jerk, what you'd call is there's reflective versus reflexive. And
Oh
if you're
yeah,
like a,
reflex, yeah.
yeah, so if you're a reflexive individual, you score very low on the cognitive reflection test. You're kind of I make my decisions based on gut and intuition. Those are the people
Yeah.
that recalled almost every time. Like they were the high recallers. The low recallers were the people that did really well on the cognitive reflection test. So it's just like one
Very
indicator of
interesting.
bias. And it was
Yeah.
something we threw into the experiment at the very last second before we ran it. And it was by far the most important predictor in the entire model, was how well
Wow.
the person did on CRT, just as an indicator of the behavioral aspect of this decision is so important. It's probably more important than actually the aspects of what's failing and how's it's failing, things like that.
Whoa. Every time I talk to you, I learn so much, but I also get it makes me quite uncomfortable, George. I have to be honest.
Well,
I
it makes
have
it
to.
really fun to study these things. Like it's a fun area to study because
Yeah.
the decisions make an impact on public health.
Yeah.
Um, the decisions are just ripe with problems, and I don't think companies have quite figured out how to make these decisions, which is why, I try to do this research. I don't have all the answers because I've made some very poor ones in the past,
Mm.
which is why I study it.
And speaking of some of your other papers, we have like about 7 minutes left in our hour, but I would really love to talk on case number 2. We probably won't have time for case number 3, but um, at least case number 2 I would like to cover, which is the influence of female directors on product recall decisions. I have some bullet points here, but I would love to just open up the floor to you on this one because it was so interesting for
Sure.
me to read.
Right. So there's a on the paper, Corinne Post is the third author, I think. She's a gender research expert, comparing, and she's focused mostly on female diversity of females in management teams. She
Mm,
approached Katie Wowak, the lead author, and myself about doing a recall study where we examine the influence of female leaders on recall decisions.
mhm,
And we ended up on the board level for a couple of reasons. One, Corinne's expertise is on female board members. And
mhm.
two, the board data is much more available than executive data. It's harder to know who's the quality manager at a plant. It's easy to know who the board members are of a publicly traded company.
Okay.
So some of it is just being practical, and the other is this is Corinne's area of expertise, and the board sets the tone, as we say in the paper, for how important decisions are made. We also interviewed a female executive at Medtronic at the time in the quality function, and she reported to the CEO, and she's a wonderful individual. And we asked her, like, is this legitimate? Like, how involved is the board in these decisions?
Right.
And what she told us is she's like, my job is to go to the board meetings every quarter and report to them on uh, the product recall decisions that we made and that we didn't make, the big ones over the last quarter. So this was helpful for us because this was like validating for us the importance of the board. But then we said, okay, and so how do women and men behave differently in these meetings? And we hadn't really told her our study findings at this point.
Okay.
And so it was a great response. So she's like, and this is not, I'm going to say something that men might be offended by.
Okay.
Um, and this author team is 2 men and 2 women, and that's on purpose because for a while it was just me and Katie and Corinne, and
Mhm,
I was outnumbered in many ways. And so we're like, you know what, we got to balance this team out because we don't
mhm.
want a paper that is unbalanced when it comes to this issue. But anyway,
Yeah.
this individual at this company said, well, when it comes to the board, the men want to know how much money we're going to lose. The women want to know if anybody got hurt by the product quality problem. And so we're like, okay, this perfectly encapsulates our paper. Like, that's our paper in a nutshell. And we hadn't even told her the results of the paper. And so for us, we're like, we're on to something important here. If
Mm,
this individual from a very, very respected company, and she was in charge of quality at the company. If
mhm.
she validates that, then we're onto something. So we find that those effects are real. That each additional woman added to the board speeds up the recall decision making time, in particular for the most serious recalls. So it's got the details at the back of the paper, but we actually translate each additional female to many, many weeks faster for these decisions.
Weeks,
Yeah. So
not hours or days, weeks.
no,
Wow.
well, yeah, the hourly data wouldn't be available. So, we had a
Yeah.
huge battle to fight in this paper around the reviewers and editors didn't believe that the board was this involved, and they certainly didn't
Okay.
want to believe that gender mix on the board would make a darn bit of difference. And so we spent a lot of time making those arguments using prior literature, a lot of which the Corinne Post, one of the co-authors, had published,
Mhm.
showing that in fact this is a common theme in other areas of research. It just had never been shown in recalls. It's a
Okay.
common theme that gender diversity at the board level changes firm performance.
Wow.
It was a new thing for the operations management editors and reviewers of this journal. So we had to really work hard to convince them that it does change how the firm makes these decisions. And I'm on a paper now where we're looking at female executives because we finally got female executive data from medical device
Uh-huh.
companies. We
Okay.
find the exact same thing, that the more female executives in the firm, the faster these decisions are made. So I'm working on trying to get that paper published. It's under review right now.
Wow. It's just fascinating research. I mean, it's just fascinating. I'll leave it at that. I could go on and on about this, but we do have only 3 minutes left, and I
Sorry.
would like to ask you one last question before we wrap up, which is, and I told you I was going to ask you this, uh, which is, this is the hot seat, right? So I never tell you exactly what I'm going to ask, but I did tell you this. And that was, if you could go back to 2005 when we were both coworkers together at Guidon, and sort of talk to yourself. Say you had, let's say, oh, well, you only have 2 minutes with yourself now, and you could find that time machine and go back. What would you want to say to your younger self? And consider that your younger self is like today, meaning like, so it's 2023 and you're 30 years old or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
what would you say to yourself now, thinking about where our industry is going and in the next, let's say 10 years?
Yeah. First of all, I wish I was 30 years old. We'll just start right there. Like that would be awesome. But I would say that um, I would want to challenge my boss on how I'm incentivized. And then
Mm,
I would always, and I know this sounds um, idealistic, but
yeah.
Guidance was always about the patient comes first. That's
Hmm.
what they said a lot, but these
Hmm.
decisions were not always made in that way.
Mm,
And I think that that's not a guidance thing. That's a common thing. Like
right.
because these are financial decisions that have huge implications. And
Hmm.
so structuring these decisions so that you put the life of the patient first.
Hmm.
Pretend it's your child that has this device. Like my second company was a heart defects in children device. We were making devices to close up holes in the heart of infants.
Mm,
If you put yourself in the parent's position, it's your child with this device, what would you
hmm.
do? If you
Hmm.
asked yourself that question more often, I think I would have made decisions with less, I would have made better decisions. And I can't
Yeah.
necessarily pinpoint a decision I made that was bad. I just know that I was an aggressive decision maker when it came to these decisions. I would push the envelope. Um,
Hmm.
and and I don't think that that was probably the right approach. I think putting yourself in the position of the parent of a kid who has a device in their chest or somewhere in their body that has this device, now what do you do? What that means is you're often going to recall, right?
Hmm.
And so that's the challenge is, well, I mean, you don't want to always recall, but it should be the default. And the one thing I'll end with is in my work consulting with big medical device companies, I've talked to the head of quality at one of them who did happen to be female. It doesn't, not just because of that, but what she
Hmm.
said is I tell my team when they bring me a product recall problem, they have 3 days and then we're recalling. So you have 3 days to prove me wrong. The bias is if it's a problem, we better recall. And we're going to make this decision in 3 days. And if you can't prove it, that it doesn't need to be recalled, we're going to recall. That's a
Hmm.
very radical approach to these decisions
Hmm.
that definitely puts the patient first.
Hmm.
But yeah, they're hard decisions to make. And I don't
Yeah.
know the right answer. I just know they should have more structure where there's less bias. And the FDA should probably help with that structure so
Hmm.
that it's a standardized decision. It's not so ad hoc and different across every firm.
Right. Yeah. To acknowledge the reality of human decision making and structure it. It's never going to be perfect, but at least to limit the bias that
Yeah.
may be influencing our decisions.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Ball, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us on the fourth GMP hot seat. I've really enjoyed. I always enjoy our discussions, but I especially enjoyed this one because we dedicated a whole hour to bias, and so which is really one of my favorite things to think about, to just to ponder. So I really appreciate you joining us, and thanks to everyone on the line who joined as well. It's been a real pleasure, and we will see everyone on the next GMB hot seat sometime in the future. Thanks again, Dr. Ball. Have a great day out there in
Thank
Indiana.
you. My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.